Okay, good morning and welcome to Beyond the Five Paragraph Essay. My name is Roy Speed. I am a longtime homeschooling dad, and in 2014, my wife and I founded HS College Bound. We provide services to families homeschooling through the high school years. And I thank the organization of Virginia Homeschoolers for sponsoring this session. Virginia Homeschoolers is Virginia's only statewide homeschooling support and lobbying group that is also fully inclusive and completely volunteer run. We're all together today only because they conceived of this session and invited me to speak to you. So my thanks to Virginia Homeschoolers. Now, I'm going to tell you a little about myself because it's relevant to this discussion. For the last 30 years, I've been a writing consultant to large organizations. I advise them on their writing challenges. In other words, when writing becomes a business issue, I step in to help. I analyze the situation. I help them understand how their writing is falling short, what they need to do. I also design writing training, including e-learning programs. One of the programs I designed has been deployed around the world. It's been translated into 17 languages. It's become required training for more than 250,000 people. Now, in my work and in many projects, I've worked with and trained highly educated people, PhDs, MBAs, MDs, and more. So I've had a close-up view of the writing of some of our most educated individuals. And when I review the shortcomings of their writing, I see a pattern. In other words, there are things about writing that most of us are never taught. Even our best educated students, certain things about writing are just not part of most academic training. So now I've titled this talk Beyond the Five Paragraph Essay. And just in case you don't all know what that is, I'm going to show you. It's basically a structure. And the idea is that the first paragraph of your essay is an introduction containing a thesis, and then you have 3 body paragraphs, and finally a paragraph that forms a conclusion. Now, this structure, the way that it is used, the way that it is assigned, it's often assigned to students who are, writing their first essays. And one of the bizarre things about the way that we teach students to write the essay is that students don't read any essays typically before they are asked to write them. Instead of reading an essay, they're given this thing, and they're told, to write in this structure. It is a purely academic exercise. This is an artifact of the classroom. Part of my objection to it is its unreality. No one in the real world ever has to produce the 5-paragraph essay. For similar reasons, I'm not enthusiastic about the emphasis that we place in our English classes, the emphasis that we place on writing literary analysis. Once our kids leave school, will they ever write literary analysis again? I think we can do a lot better, get a lot closer to the writing skills our students will actually need, and not just in their academic careers, but throughout their lives. So I'm going to show you 5 things about writing most students are never taught, but that I think they should be taught. Now, first up, our students need to be taught how to think about what they're going to write, including how to get their heads screwed on straight about the nature of the challenge and what it means to write effectively. So the number one thing that I'm going to show you, the first thing, in other words, number one, is mind mapping with a focus on the reader. And some of you may be familiar with mind mapping. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by it and how I teach it to my students and the skill involved, the skill that I want them to develop. So to illustrate, In my course, Logical Communication, I have my students read a particular essay by a really fine writer, and then I ask them this question. If you were to write that sort of essay, what might you write about? And in their workbooks, each student has to brainstorm a list of possible topics. And then I have them do this. Have a look at the instruction under the directions here. Number 1, from your list of topics on the previous page, pick the topic most likely to be of interest to other students in this class. In other words, I asked students from the start to think about their reader. Now, that may seem like a small thing. It's actually a huge thing. Part of what makes the 5-paragraph essay an academic exercise is that it's not written for a reader, unlike virtually every other kind of writing in the world. It is written as an exercise, literally an activity that the teacher can grade. And in the real world, that's just not the way writing works. So, in this exercise, my students pick the topic most likely to be of interest to other students in the class. Now, that seems easy enough, right? It's not. Many students are easily deceived by their own desires. They think to themselves things like, I'm really good at photography, so that's the topic that other students will be interested in. Or, I'm a really diligent student, so the other students will be interested to know my study habits. Okay, can you imagine students going down this rabbit hole? Yeah, this is what they do. Thinking about the reader is just not as easy as it sounds. It's actually similar to listening. We all know how important it is to be a good listener. How often are we actually good listeners? For most of us, attending to the reader, to his or her interests, to her needs, to her concerns, attending to the reader is a similar kind of challenge. Now, notice the next instructions. Number 2 says, write that topic in the center rectangle below. Number 3, brainstorm particular points you would discuss, jotting a word or two representing that point in the circular bubbles below. Let me show you what that looks like. This is the actual page from the workbook, and on this is the form of the first mind map that they do in my class. The students brainstorm the various points that they might make on this topic, and they put the major points or ideas in these great big bubbles, and then they use these little squares to put in supporting points, supporting details, things that they might have to explain, or concrete examples, and so on. Now, in the final stage, once they've basically fleshed out this whole mind map, in the final stage, they would sequence everything. They would insert numbers next to each of their main points, these big bubbles indicating, okay, I'm going to start with this one up here, and then this is going to be the second point down here, and then here, like that. All the while asking themselves, in what sequence is all this going to make the most sense to my readers? Now, a few things to notice about this process. Or about this tool, the mind map. First of all, the importance of having an efficient writing process. I believe in giving students an efficient process. In the real world, we almost never have unlimited time to write. We almost always face a deadline. So writing well is good, but writing efficiently can be just as important. And for our students to write efficiently, they need good tools. And I'm convinced that mind mapping is one of those really important tools. Here's a way to think of the value of mind mapping. The goal is to produce a really strong first draft. In other words, if you do a really good job of mapping out your ideas and the individual points that you want to make in support of each idea, if you do a really good job of that, your first draft comes out pretty strong. And it turns out that producing a really strong first draft is one of the keys to efficiency. The reason, when you produce a first draft that is a logical mess, you end up wallowing in successive revisions. You get stuck in revision land. And that's where you can eat up gobs of time, endlessly futzing with your material, trying to fix the wording here and there. But the real problem is that everything's in the wrong place, or you've got, missing pieces of your argument, or your the thing that you want to write about. Not everything is there, and so the futzing with your wording isn't going to fix any of that. Anyway, producing a really strong first draft is a kind of prerequisite for writing efficiently. And so, in my view, here's what an efficient process might look like. First of all, you produce a really good mind map. You've got a roadmap to your first draft. Then you actually write the first draft, and it comes out pretty strong. So from there, you do minor revision, and you may be done. By the way, you might be interested to know, when I do this mind mapping exercise in my class, I give my students only 3 to 4 minutes to flesh out this mind map. They're not writing sentences, remember. They're only scribbling words and phrases in these bubbles and squares. And those words and phrases, they're just serving as placeholders for the ideas or points that the students want to make. So in just a few minutes, they can get a tremendous amount of work done. And look at this. This is the very next exercise I give them. In other words, they do another mind map. This is the very next page of their workbooks. And look at the instruction. Pick a different topic from your list, the one second most likely to be of interest to students in this class. And then they produce another mind map. Now, I do it this way. I have them produce 2 mind maps in rapid succession for a reason. I want them to discover how creative they are, how productive their minds are. Within the space of 10 to 15 minutes, they have produced complete outlines for 2 different essays. And it turns out that most students really take to this mind mapping tool. What they discover is that when you're using the right tool, when you are prompting your thinking in the right way, producing content can feel easy. It can feel like turning on a tap and just letting it flow. Okay, so that is number 1, mind mapping, but with a focus on the reader. It's pretty good, isn't it? Now, here is the number 2 thing about writing that most students are never taught. It is thinking strategically about your opening. I'm going to show you, and I'm going to explain all these concepts using material from my course, Logical Communication. Here is the section where I first begin talking to students about their openings. Have a look at what this opening paragraph says. The opening of an essay sometimes seems like the hardest thing to write. So our aim here is to make it a lot easier to write and even fun to write. And with my own students, I don't ask that they worry too much about their openings until they've already produced the first draft of their first essay. And then I show them this section. And I want you to look at the second guideline. See these there's 3 bulleted guidelines here. Have an opening. In other words, you can't dive right into your topic with no thought for how best to introduce it. Your opening should, one, be separate from the main body, and two, mentally prepare the reader for what's coming. Now, look at this second one, though. Make it engaging. The reader should feel like reading on. Seems simple enough, right? But my students take this simple idea, this simple standard, the reader feels like reading on, and they use it to test their openings. When they want to find out whether a particular opening has promise, they need a reader who can be their guinea pig. And if you're going to use your mom as your guinea pig, well, you don't want to ask her opinion. What you'll get back is her opinion, like, well, my opinion is that you need to work on your grammar. You shouldn't ask her what she thinks. What you'll get back, she'll tell you what she thinks. Like, well, I think you could be less wordy. No, here's what you have to do. You mark just your opening paragraph, and then you say, Mom, I've marked a new opening here that I'm playing around with. I'd like you to read just this passage, and then I want to ask you a question. So she reads it, and then you take the paper back and you ask the question. So, Mom, did you feel like reading on? So the point here, the whole point here, is for students to see that the writing has to do a certain job. And they need to figure out how to find out what is the job of the various parts of an essay, and figure out how to test it, how to find out if it's working. And this whole point about, having students see that the writing has to do its job, it's not just about expressing your innermost being or whatever. Students Students, I'm sure you've all noticed this, that students tend to identify with their writing. At some point, they begin to think that their writing is them, that there's no space between them and their writing. And what I try to do in my course is get them to begin to see that no, your writing is a product that you produce. And there are ways of gauging how you're doing. And if you can gauge how you're doing, well, then you can improve it. And so in a big part of my course is, showing students how to do that, how to treat your writing like a product and continually improve it. So at any rate, once they understand what their opening must do, I show them some options. There's a page in their workbook with this headline: Writing Tools, 7 Options for an Effective Opening. Now I'm going to zoom in on it. This is what it looks like. 7 options for an effective opening. And see what the intro says here. In one sense, there may be an infinite number of possible openings. It's probably more useful, however, to notice that most openings draw on just a handful of devices or techniques. And that's what I show my students, is this handful. Like, look at option number 1. Simply announce your topic. And the challenge with this approach is to be engaging. Simply announcing a topic is no guarantee of anything. The reader's reaction may be of the ho-hum variety. Number 2, begin with an anecdote. The challenge, the story you tell must be engaging and serve to illustrate your topic, or at least set the scene for it. Number 3, begin with a memory, an experience. Number 4, begin with a surprising fact or observation. Number 5, begin with a joke. Number 6, create suspense. Number 7, raise a controversial issue. You'll notice that each of these, that there are cautions with each one, but they're all worth experimenting with. So what I do is, I have my students, at this point in the course, they've already produced the first draft of their first essay. So I have them take a look at that first draft and focus on the opening. Did they use one of these approaches? If so, which one? Does it work? And so on. So then for homework, I give my students this assignment. For the draft you just wrote, produce 2 brand new openings, but each using a different technique from this list. So the idea here is twofold. First, it's to stretch them, to move them out of their comfort zone, to get them to try on an approach that, left to their own devices, they might never have tried. Second, the idea is to show them that it is all about producing a particular effect. You know, throw something at the wall and see if it sticks. Okay, so that is my number 2 thing that most students are never taught: thinking strategically about their openings. Now, my number 3 thing has to do with sentence structure, and specifically sentence structures that work. The fact is, certain sentence structures virtually guarantee that the sentence will be difficult to read. Other sentence structures virtually guarantee that the sentence will be easy to read, and our students need to know the difference. And that's the whole point of this section in my writing instruction. The concept that I use to talk about this issue of sentence structure is what I call hoodoo writing. And let me show you what it's all about. I'm going to use an example, and this is an example from published writing. It's from an essay by an economist, and have a look at how this goes. With public opinion in Brazil increasingly hostile to the continuation of slavery, and many Brazilians keenly aware of and painfully embarrassed by the fact that their country was the last one in the Western world to still have slavery, the plantation owners were increasingly isolated, and some began freeing their slaves themselves, in anticipation of official emancipation, and in some cases in hopes of retaining these workers as employees. Now, it's not great, is it? It's too much. Did you notice that by the end, by the time you reach the final words of that paragraph, you can't remember how it began? In other words, the problem here, you might describe it as data overload. You know, the unfortunate thing about us readers is that we all have pea-sized brains. We can only hold so much information in a single go. And this overloading a sentence with data this way, it simply doesn't work for readers. So once again, you notice we're thinking about readers. Here is a revision that illustrates the basic approaches that I call hoodoo. Public opinion in Brazil was increasingly hostile to the continuation of slavery. Among countries in the Western world, Brazil was the last to still have slavery. Many Brazilians were keenly aware of this fact and found it painfully embarrassing. As a result, plantation owners found themselves increasingly isolated. Some even began freeing their slaves themselves, partly in anticipation of official emancipation, but also in some cases in hopes of retaining these workers as employees. A lot easier to follow, right? A lot easier to digest. And what's the first thing you notice about how this was done? Yeah, yes, it's broken down. Yes, smaller sentences. Yeah, you have to break it up. And in fact, the original was one sentence. How many sentences in the revision? Yeah, there are actually 5 sentences in the revision. But there's something else going on here. Like Lightening the load of any one sentence is part of what I mean by hoodoo writing. In fact, I give my students the guideline. I say that your bread and butter standard should be basically one idea per sentence. And then occasionally you can vary it up and put two ideas in a sentence, but then go right back to your your standard one idea per sentence. But there's something else going on here, and it has to do with the way these individual sentences are constructed in the revision. Let me show you a close-up look. Here's the basic idea. The idea behind hoodoo writing is twofold. First, don't overload any one sentence with too much information or too many ideas. Second, make the subject, the who, and the verb, the do, the building blocks of your sentences. Now, what does that mean? Well, look closely at the sentence structures in the revision. Public opinion was. Brazil was. Many Brazilians were. Plantation owners found. Some began. In each sentence, the subject and the verb, what I'm calling the who and the do of each sentence, are close together, near the beginning. And when you do that, it makes it much more likely that the sentence is going to be easy for your readers to digest. Here is how I summarize it on this page for my students in this at a glance box. Your sentences will be easy to digest when the subject and verb appear early in the sentence, operate in tandem as a 1-2 punch, subject, verb, subject, verb, subject, verb, subject, verb, subject, verb. Now, by the way, I did not invent this. The truth is, there were generations of journalists who used to know this. They used to know this in their bones. Like when you think back to, think back to journalists in the 20th century of the 1930s and the 40s and the 50s, those kind of journalists that, in the movies, they're always hard drinking, hard smoking. Those guys, they all knew this. In fact, if you look at the writing of someone like Ernest Hemingway, what you'll notice is that their writing is more often hoodoo than not. In other words, just analyze Hemingway's sentence structures, and what you'll see at the beginning of each sentence is hoodoo, 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 hoodoo. Now, so here's another way to look at it. The Hoodoo Principle is about simplicity, directness, straightforwardness. In academic writing in particular, writers routinely use sentence structures that are unnecessarily complex. And look at this example. The transition in these late sonnets, primarily addressed to the lady, to a legal posture of contest over wrongs rather than rights to possession or arbitration and mutual submission, brings home with considerable force the oppositional character of what must be recognized, at least in its broader contours, as a sequence. Now, that's a pretty awful sentence. But what really helps is to, if you want to understand why is this such an awful sentence, well, yeah, it has too much stuff in it for sure. But there's more to it than that. Ask yourself, what is the subject of this sentence? Anybody see what it is? Yes, it's the word transition. Now ask yourself, what is the verb? Anybody see what it is? Good. Yes, brings. And now that you see the positioning of the subject and the verb here, we can begin to see what is wrong with this sentence structure. This professor decided that right after the subject of the sentence, he would stick in there a really complex and subtle series of ideas. And then complete the thought begun by the transition. That's a recipe for a hard to read, hard to understand sentence. In fact, see the key idea here? Never jam a truckload of information between your subject and your verb. Doing so will always cause your reader undue effort. Rather, keep your subject and verb close together near the beginning of the sentence. Now, I want to pause for a moment and just think about this professor who wrote this sentence. This is a Shakespearean scholar. I read a lot of literary analysis. I teach Shakespeare and other literature, so I have to read a lot of literary analysis. And I can tell you with some confidence that there is more bad literary analysis out there than there is good literary analysis. And even the good stuff is often not well written. So what we have here is a professor who specializes. He teaches great literature. That's his specialty. Now, what is great literature? It's great writing. So writing, in a sense, is his specialty. Yet he himself has little awareness of or understanding of sentence structure, and he gives no thought to his reader. So, I don't think I'm making this up here. There really is an unawareness among academics of many things about writing that I think our students need to understand. So back to the point of number 3, it is sentence structures that work. And students need practice with applying Hoodoo principles. Just because I show them this principle doesn't mean that they really understand how to apply it and like edit their own work. They need writing workouts. Like I'm going to show you an exercise that I do with my students. Here is an original sentence this is from Published Writing. By the early 1980s, the search by historians of medicine to identify the Athenian plague by relating the clinical features presented by Thucydides to modern-day disease had reached a standstill. Now, I've read worse sentences, but this one is not great, right? It's not easy to digest. And it helps, once again, to understand the structure of this sentence. So what I have my students do is analyze each bad sentence by locating the subject and the verb. So first, the subject. And anybody see what it is? Yeah, it's the word search. Okay, so there's the subject. Now, what is the verb? Yes, it's had reached. Now that you see the subject and the verb, you can see that in between the subject and the verb, this writer has stuck an idea, and it's about historians of medicine trying to identify the Athenian plague by relating the clinical features presented by Thucydides to modern day disease. Okay, so what my students do to fix this bad sentence is they take that idea stuck in between the subject and the verb, and they make it the new opening sentence. Historians of medicine sought to identify the Athenian plague by relating the clinical features presented by Thucydides to modern day disease. And then they follow up with the rest of it. But by the early 1980s, their efforts had reached a standstill. Now, I would argue that the revision, and most of my students come up with a revision very, very like this. It's so much better than the original, is it not? So this is a skill to be able to take an unwieldy sentence and use an array of tools to cure what ails the unwieldy sentence. This is number 3, sentence structures that work in the Hoodoo Principle. Number 4 is kind of on the same topic, but it's a different solution, a different cure for an unwieldy sentence. It's one of, the idea is certain writing techniques help transform a difficult to read sentence into one that's easy to digest. And one such technique is something that I'm going to call the umbrella phrase. It's a word or phrase that sets the stage for the information that follows. Now, I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. Let me show you an example. Here is the original. You can avoid exposure to asbestos by paying attention to asbestos warning signs, recognizing materials in the work environment that may contain asbestos, and following our company's safety procedures and policies. Now, that's a lot. It can be rendered a lot more digestible with what I'm calling an umbrella phrase. And here's how that looks. You can avoid exposure to asbestos by doing 3 simple things. So you see how that works? And if you recall, what I said was that an umbrella phrase is a word or phrase that sets the stage for the information that follows. So the idea is you've got a sentence that contains a lot of, unwieldy information. And what you do is you craft a phrase that works as a kind of setup for all that complicated information. Now, how is that done? Well, once again, it's done by really understanding the original. Like in the original, there were 3 items: paying attention to asbestos warning signs, recognizing materials in the work environment that may contain asbestos, and following our company's safety procedures and policies. And what the student has to ask him or herself is, now, what are, I see these 3 things, what are they all? They are all, if you're going to set up these things to be digested by the reader, you got to figure out, so what are these things? Well, they're all things you can do to avoid exposure to asbestos. And so that becomes your umbrella phrase. You can avoid exposure to asbestos by doing 3 simple things. Now, that's a pretty sophisticated effect, but students are well able to do this. Again, they just need practice. They just need workouts. Let me show you one of the sentences that I give them as a workout, and this is going to be a passage again from published writing, and again it's going to be a literary analysis. Have a look at this example. Here's the original. That the poet of Gawain was a learned man, most likely a secular cleric, but possibly a priest, that he knew well chivalric life and customs, and that he elected to compose not only in his native language, but also using a native verse form, can all be deduced from the poem itself. Now, once again, I think you'll notice by the time you get to the end, you can't remember how it began. And it's because at a certain point, as you're reading a sentence like this, your brain gets filled up. And so what do? Because the sentence is still going. Well, you jettison what you've taken in so far to make room for the back end of the sentence. And then when you complete the sentence, interesting, you can't remember how it began. Why? Because you threw that stuff out to make room for the rest. So there's a structural issue about human brains that our students need to understand if you're going to be an effective writer. Now, once again, there are a series of items that could be set up using an umbrella phrase. So I give my students the challenge of taking this sentence and using an umbrella phrase to make it more readable. And here's what they do. From the poem itself, we can deduce 3 things about the poet of Gawain. First, that he was a learned man, most likely a secular cleric, but possibly a priest. Second, that he knew well chivalric life and customs. And finally, that he elected to compose not only in his native language, but using a native verse form. By the way, can you imagine if all our students' textbooks were written with this kind of clarity? How wonderful that would be. So this is what I'm trying to teach students to do with the umbrella phrase. Now, that's my number 4, and I promised you 5 things about writing that most students are never taught. This next thing I call signposts. They are usually referred to in English classes or writing classes as transitional expressions. And I would argue that there's more to them than is acknowledged in most writing instruction. And to show you my own approach to these things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change over to a few pages from my workbook. This is actually peering into the workbook, Logical Communication. And you'll notice the title of this is Signposts, Indicating Your Logical Direction. And this is the distinction between the way these things are traditionally taught as transitional expressions. I talk more explicitly about what is the nature of that transition. Like, have a look at this example. Difficulties in the new hot tub project are increasing. The budget is out of control. The etiquette handbook is 2 weeks behind schedule. Senior management wants to demonstrate its commitment to the objectives set earlier in the year. Senior management is recommending that the project be continued. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that paragraph very hard to follow. And what I want to do here is show you the effect that signposts can have on clarifying the logical flow inside this paragraph. Here's the revision with signposts. I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm here. Sorry about that. Difficulties in the new hot tub project are increasing. The budget, for instance, is out of control, and the etiquette handbook is 2 weeks behind schedule. Senior management, however, wants to demonstrate its commitment to the objectives set earlier in the year and is recommending that the project be continued. Now, most people find that a lot easier to digest, and yet the only real changes are what I'm going to call the signposts. Anybody see what they are? Yes, for instance is one. However is another. Good. Yeah. Look, here's what they are. Well, first, what they do is they signal the logical direction of each new thought. And so here's what they are in this particular revision. For instance, so difficulties in the new hot tub project are increasing. The budget, for instance. And the phrase, for instance, basically says to the reader, signals to the reader, I will give you an example of that thing I just said about the difficulties in the hot tub project. Then the signpost and communicates to the reader, I'm continuing in the same vein. I'm going to give you another example. Then we hit however, and however signals to the reader, major change of direction, going back the way we were coming. Now we're contradicting what we were saying earlier. Senior management wants to demonstrate its commitment to the objective set earlier in the year. And then we get another and, which means continuing in the same vein, in other words, in opposition to the earlier parts of the paragraph. As it turns out, signposts actually contain at least 5 separate types of signals, logical signals. And so I want to show you what it is that I give my students. And by the way, you can see I use this very example, and and here is how I summarize the key idea for my students. Signposts are words and phrases that signal to your reader the logical direction of your train of thought. They often come at the beginning of a sentence, but you may also begin the sentence and then insert the signpost, as we did here. Senior management, however. Now, in their workbooks, my students get this. It's basically my gathering of all the signposts known to humankind, and then I have organized them into 5 discrete categories. The first category is signposts that supplement or intensify what was said earlier. This is the type of signpost where you're continuing in the same vein, only more so. So you're intensifying the thing you said earlier. Have a look at this example. Accidents like this rarely occur in my department. In fact, this is the first accident we've had in more than 4 years. You see how it's continuing in the same vein, only more so. It's intensifying the claim made in the earlier sentence. And so here are some common intensifiers. The next category, category 2, signposts that qualify or contradict what was said earlier. And however is one of the most popular, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. And I try to encourage my students to explore how these other ones work, because they can really enrich your students' arsenal of tools for conveying the train of thought in a paragraph. Category 3 is signposts that signal examples, like, for example, for instance, for one thing, for another, and so on. And then signposts that show cause or show consequence. In other words, cause and effect is something that we're continually exploring in writing. What caused that, and what were the consequences of that? And so we've listed separately signposts that show cause or reason for something, and signposts that show the consequence or results of something. And have a look at this example up here. We canceled the project. After all, showing cause or reason, we hadn't heard from you in weeks. We therefore, showing a consequence, in other words, because we hadn't heard from you, we assumed you weren't interested. And then final category, signposts that help to clarify or summarize. In other words, the thing that I just said may need some clarification, or it may need to be restated, or I may need to summarize several things that I just said. And so we've got signposts used for summary and signposts used for restatement. And again, students need workouts with these things, and I also I routinely send them back into their own writing to analyze their own use of signposts. Like, are there particular signposts that you use over and over? Are there other signposts that you have never in your life used? And I encourage them to try on the signposts that they've never used before and figure out how they work. Again, it's about enriching their arsenal of writing tools. Okay, so that's the 5 things that I wanted to show you. 5 things about writing that most students are never taught. And so, any questions? I see will you publish the textbook? Can we buy your workbook? I'm actually working on that. My intention is to publish it. My first book, let me show you something. This is the page on our website where we list all of our online courses. You can see the first book that I published was The Writer's Guide to Grammar. I'm teaching a course on it this year. It's a live interactive course. And here, I want to show you. Okay, there you see. So this is the book on Amazon, The Writer's Guide to Grammar. And what I'm going to publish is I'm going to publish logical communication. This is the workbook. You see, it's almost 300 pages. I'm going to publish this as the writer's guide to logical communication. So it's going to be the next stage. And this book, it contains readings that my students do. I'm a big believer in having my students read great essays. And so there are more than 40 different essays that my students read and analyze and discuss as part of this course while they're learning all of these writing principles and writing tools. So the answer is yes, I'm going to publish the workbook, but I'm still about a year away. I'm teaching logical communication again this year and beginning in September, and I will be trying to finalize the workbook. But there's still a lot to do. You know, I have to get formal permission for reprinting all the essays, and there's really a lot of administrative type work to do, as well as tweaking the effectiveness of the material. Now, let's see. The question. Okay, I see the question. In the beginning, you mentioned you see the same kinds or types of mistakes when you are reading others' writing. Could you tell a little about that? Yeah, I think what you're referring to is something that I said about in the workplace when I'm reviewing the writing of our most well-educated people. I see patterns. That's what you're referring to? Yes. Yeah. One of the things that I saw a lot, and it really didn't matter how educated the person was. It didn't matter how smart the person was. If they'd never been trained, then there was a thing that many of them struggled with, and it was perceiving the logical flow of their own writing. It really does take training, but it is a vital skill, the ability to perceive the logical progression of ideas through your own writing. You have to be able to perceive it so that you can tell when it's gone off the rails. When what you have, instead of a logical progression, is a jumble of disjointed ideas. It's vital that every writer be able to perceive that type of writing problem. And we don't get a lot of training in it in academic writing. You know, I could have included the ability to perceive logical flow as something that we're not taught to do. But it actually is. This is the reason that my course. This is the reason that my course is called Logical Communication, is because I consider this ability foundational to strong writing. And so let me show you the kind of thing that I do. You know, I told you that my kids read a lot of essays. Here you'll see I have them reading this essay. It's called History Retweets. It's the very first essay in logical communication. Notice it was published in the Wall Street Journal. The subtitle is How Ancient Romans Created Social Media. So my students read this essay, And then I give them this exercise. After you've read this essay, return to the beginning, and in the rectangle next to each paragraph, capture in a short phrase or clause the point the writer is making with that paragraph. So that's what they do with these rectangles. They try to scribble just a few words capturing, okay, what's the idea here? What's the point here? And then what happens is once they've scribbled the idea, the point behind each paragraph, what they discover is that they can look at these rectangles and they can perceive the skeletal structure of the writing. They can see the logical progression of ideas. And so you see, from the beginning in this course, I'm trying to train them to perceive the logical progression of ideas. And you'll notice the mind map is essentially about the same skill. It's about mapping out your ideas, but in a way that enables you to arrange them into a logical progression. So anyway, that's one of the really common issues that I saw in the writing, even of really, really well-educated people. And yes, I'm teaching close reading. I teach close reading of these essays because I am convinced that that reading carefully is key to writing well. You know, when in the essays that my students read, you know, I have them read these essays, and whenever they tell me, oh, I really love that part about blankety blank, and they describe a particular passage in the essay, and we go to that passage, and what I do is whenever they tell me, oh, this was so interesting, or this was so compelling, this was so charming, or it was so funny, it was beautiful, whatever it is they're loving about it, I challenge them to figure out how it was done. And we go back into the details, and they reverse engineer the writing. They figure out, how was that done? And of course, what happens is they discover writing tools or devices that they would like to use in their own writing. Okay. All right. Okay, well, we're about out of time. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for you know, hanging out with me and listening to this. And I wish you and your students the best of luck with your homeschooling. And thanks again for coming. And thanks to Virginia Homeschoolers for making this possible. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day.